The problem with calling Trump a threat to democracy is that we have a really narrow idea of what it looks like when democracies fail. We imagine democratic failure as being some spectacular event, a military coup, or an illegal power grab, or the declaration of martial law.
To protect the Republic of the Philippines and our democracy.
We don't really imagine it looking like this.
It's a child's desk, but that's okay. It's the smallest desk I've ever seen.
But political scientists do. Because in a country like the US, the death of democracy is gonna start off looking kind of normal. So normal, you might not even notice it's happening until it's too late.
Well, I respect the move, but the entire thing has been a witch hunt, and there is no collusion between...
Trump's firing of former FBI Director James Comey has gotten a lot of media attention, in part because it's really easy to explain why it matters. If Trump fired Comey over the Russia investigation, that would be obstruction of justice, which is a crime. But a lot of what worries political scientists about Trump is tougher to explain in a soundbite like that, because for the most part, it's stuff that's totally legal.
It turns out that government officials can exploit weaknesses in the law in ways that are destructive to the rule of law as a whole.
This bearer of bad news is Aziz Huq. He's a law professor at the University of Chicago, and he's written a lot about a concept called democratic backsliding, which kind of sounds like something Hillary Clinton does at a wedding. Backsliding is what happens when a democratically elected government starts attacking the institutions that make democracy work. I know, the dance thing was cooler. And Huq argues that what makes backsliding so dangerous is that it's really hard to know when it starts.
In many other countries, the way that we see democratic backsliding happening is through a series of discrete legal changes, each of which is on their own completely lawful.
A great example of what backsliding looks like is Venezuela's former president Hugo Chavez. The 90s. Chavez was elected as a democratic populist. But over time, he changed.
And while remaining popular, Chavez has been anything but democratic.
He got frustrated with opposition from courts and the media, so he started doing things like firing judges, using anti-defamation laws to silence journalists, and even describing unfriendly news organizations as, quote, enemies of the homeland.
Los dueños de medios dicen mentiras, elaboran mentiras. Los medios de comunicación no siempre están al servicio de la verdad.
What's scary about Chavez's story is that he didn't need a military coup to screw up Venezuela's democracy.
The man who came to office by democracy is doing everything he can to snuff it out.
He did it legally by slowly turning his supporters and political allies against the country's democratic institutions.
Yo les recomiendo que se tomen un calmante, que cojan mínimo, porque si no, yo les voy a aplicar el mínimo. Yo mismo les voy a aplicar el mínimo.
Autocrats in other parts of the world have gone after those institutions very early on in the process of backsliding.
And that's what worries political scientists about Trump. Trump shows a deep distrust of America's democratic institutions. He lashes out at judges, calls journalists the enemy of the people, accuses watchdog agencies of conspiring against him. He questions the legitimacy of an election that he won. His White House stonewalls reporters to avoid answering questions.
Off. We fired you. What would you like to do with this? Off. It's off.
He is suspicious of the mechanisms that limit his authority.
This is an unprecedented judicial overreach.
And he encourages his supporters to be too. That is a catastrophic thing to be happening in a democracy. It's how democratic backsliding starts. But the thing is, none of this is illegal. As long as Republicans in Congress go along with it, there's nothing to stop Trump from publicly criticizing basic democratic institutions.
Our Constitution just doesn't do a very good job of protecting us against certain kinds of democratic failure. Whether we're in a moment of democratic backsliding really depends upon the character of our political leaders.
Which brings us back to Comey, and why it's so hard to talk about democratic backsliding without sounding paranoid. We live in a media environment that is really bad at putting things in context, that is designed to bombard us with breaking news and discrete pieces of information. And that makes it hard to identify democratic backsliding when it starts, because unless it clearly breaks the law, it's really tough to explain why any one Trump tweet or scandal poses a threat to democracy. So when Trump calls a federal judge a so-called judge, it's just just a one-off comment.
Does anyone honestly believe President Trump is going to ignore this judge's order because he's a, quote, so-called judge?
When Trump calls the press the enemy of the American people, it's all talk.
He sounds like a broken record. It's just kind of like, what else you got, Donald Trump?
I don't think that new media are well designed to tell this kind of story, because those media are designed to convey information in very small chunks. The real story is not the discrete action at a particular moment in time, but some bigger picture.
Democratic backsliding is one of those things that you can't really see from up close.
It is only when you look at changes in the aggregate that one sees the effect upon democracy as a set of institutions and practices.
That doesn't mean the Comey stuff isn't important. Obstruction of justice is obviously a big deal. But some of the biggest threats to democracy are way less dramatic, way more normal looking. And if you're waiting for the CNN chyron announcing that it's time to panic, you're gonna be waiting for a long time.